Hey, deserving listeners, this is Chapter 5 and our deep dive on Josh Powell and the disappearance of Susan Powell. Let's get into it. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor, and Berto is wearing merch from the podcast.
Merch. My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I usually help find Waldo.
So let's do a recap of what we've already established in the previous 4 chapters. It's just briefly. So Josh Powell, childhood, born 1976, Mormon family, Pacific Northwest area, 5 kids in the family, including Josh. Josh is the second. Born, first son. The parents fought a lot. He was targeted particularly by Stephen, the father, with abuse. The father was violent, but also conversely overly permissive with the kids. Stephen, the father, also exposed the 3 sons to a lot of pornography, apparently.
And his ideology was very anti-establishment, it seems, like kind of generally.
Right. And anti-Mormon as well, which the parents fought a lot about. He, Josh, was possibly rejected by his mother as a theme in the parenting and the relationship. It's hard to say. I don't want to throw the mom under the bus, but there's some minor evidence of that. At the very least, the abuse that Stephen put him through was massive. It can't be overstated, just how it would feel to be a child, to be routinely yelled at and hit and humiliated, and particularly notice that you're the one being targeted. And, when you're a kid, you don't have any resources to conceptualize it, to say like, well, this isn't my fault. Kids internalize this. So it was really hard on him. And I'm guessing that he wasn't given resources to learn how to deal with emotions in general anyway. He goes into school and adolescence. He's reportedly quiet and didn't get along with his peers, struggled in school, even though he would later test with a high IQ. And he struggled emotionally, particularly with the parents' divorce that happened when he was in high school. And we know a lot of detail about Josh and Stephen and Susan later because they all kept detailed diaries and journals, both written and recorded. So going into Josh's adulthood, he wanted to make friends in college. He had a hard time making friends. He was also very concerned about finding a girlfriend. He would pursue women, often women who didn't really like him, which on one hand is like, well, you got to bark up a lot of trees before someone replies. But he seemed to almost relish in pursuing people that were showing no sign of being into him.
So that's interesting because you mentioned potential rejection feelings related to his mom, and definitely a very distorted relation with his dad. So there could be a comfort to rejection,
Yeah, and we would see this pattern with Stephen, how he would obsess and target women and believe that these women were into him when they weren't. And
that's true, yeah.
You wonder if Josh had seen it and it was modeled to Josh, subtly or not so subtly.
Yeah.
It's just hard to tell. We could extrapolate from everything we know about Stephen stalking people and filming people and obsessing on women from afar. We could extrapolate to Josh's childhood and assume that Stephen was probably doing things along those lines when Josh was a child.
Right.
And given that Stephen has seemingly no boundaries regarding what he exposes his children to, it's not a stretch to imagine that Josh would have been exposed to at least some, if not a lot, of Stephen's stalking and obsessing and filming and harm that he would commit on women and girls, right?
Yeah.
So for Josh, at this point in his life, as a young man, he's in college, he has his life before him, he's gotten out of the house, he has hope for the future, he's doing well in school for the most part, and he has an ability to meet women and to start dating them, and he's getting some gratification for that. He has some friends, and he meets his first girlfriend. He has a first girlfriend, Catherine, and he was very worried about losing her. This would lead to controlling behavior and abusive behavior. He wasn't seemingly violent with Catherine, but he was very controlling. We reviewed that already.
And he broke that door, didn't he? Like there was a...
Yeah, she
So it wasn't
locked
direct
herself.
violence on her body, but...
Yeah, you could argue that's absolutely violent.
Yeah.
She barred herself in the bathroom to get away from the badgering, and he busted the door down. That's violent, but I didn't hear any reports of him hitting her or Susan later. But that doesn't change how abusive someone can be. You don't have to hit someone to be abusive. Catherine, would leave him after 16 months. She basically just ghosted him, just disappeared one day. And I think this is notable. I didn't really highlight it during the previous chapter, but I think this could have traumatized him. I mean,
oh, sure.
Let's establish that he was a horrible boyfriend and she deserved to leave and he deserved to be abandoned. Okay, so that's just established. And it's probably for the best, because if she had told him that she was going to leave, bad things could have happened.
Totally.
So that's established. And Josh, given his point of view and his situation, it's not hard to imagine that Josh would have been traumatized by the abandonment.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it's important to highlight this because I think it played a role in his crimes later, in his state of mind later. If a friend of yours said that after 16 months of living with someone, and maybe your friend has said to you, like, I'm even thinking about asking her to marry me, and then he tells you one day, she just disappeared. And we weren't fighting. There was no problem. Now, there was a lot of problems, but Josh, the way he saw the world, given the modeling that he saw from his dad, he probably didn't think anything was unusual about his relationship. And if your friend said, like, my girlfriend, she just disappeared. And then she called me on the phone from Utah and told me she wants to break up, and she didn't even want to talk about it. I mean, how would you feel about that?
Oh, man. Yeah, devastating. You'd feel like you need to work with that friend with kid gloves because they're going to be very hurt. I remember, the movie Swingers, where the main character, it starts with him having lost this relationship. And it wasn't even that. He wasn't ghosted, but he was devastated and he was depressed. And that's what happens normally, let alone the uncertainty of like, what, why, what? And again, to your point, we from the outside looking in know, well, hold on, dude. What do you mean? What, where? Of course. But from the inside looking out, and what we're trying to determine is, would it have a psychological impact? And yeah, it would on anyone, I think.
Right. We wouldn't be surprised if anyone, Josh or this fictional friend of yours, having some major trust issues moving forward and some sensitivities to abandonment, some hurt, some anger, some worries.
You could imagine in a future relationship, the relationship's been going on maybe a couple weeks. The person doesn't call them back right away, or they're just gone for one day. They're not sure where they're, and they start freaking out.
Right.
Where normally you wouldn't, but
yeah. So then a few years later, he meets his second girlfriend, Susan, the woman that he would marry a few months later in 2001. We went over some of the wedding videos and this kind of stuff. So then we watched a lot of the footage of Josh's father, Stephen, who would talk into his video journal about being absolutely obsessed with Susan. So you have Josh marrying Susan, and then they eventually move in with Stephen to save on rent, I think. They're a young couple. And Stephen, the father-in-law, is just obsessed with Susan, and he would secretly film her. He would secretly take pictures of her. He would take her underwear and masturbate to it. He would take her hair and masturbate. We watched videos of him talking into the camera. We watched videos of him looking at her underwear and displaying it, stuff. He would take her clothes and dress up what looked to be maybe a couch cushion or one of those big fluffy pillows, and he would film that, and because he would put an undershirt and then a dress on, and he would just be like, "Oh, Susan, I just love her." And in the videos, he would frequently mention that she must know because she's secretly sending me signals that she wants me to, right?
That's right. And, I was going to say in Colombia, it's actually really common, at least it used to be, I'm pretty sure it still is, to live with parents, even well into your, 30s sometimes. But it's also quite common that the moving out point is when you get married. Now, that's not true in all cultures. Some cultures, it's actually completely standard for the married couples to live together and all these things. So, that can vary. But I will say it's sort of less usual in the US as I've seen it. But if all that being said, if you have this very distorted relationship with your parent, it's probably not a great idea to move in with your newlywed into their house, right? Just as a general rule. And this is, one of those bad examples.
Yeah. Unfortunately, in my experience, what I will find is that the more abuse, the more problematic one's relationship is with one's parents, the more likelihood that adult child is going to engage in problematic engagement. They will choose to engage because of various different psychological reasons that I won't go into right now. And we can imagine that Josh might have been motivated by that subconsciously. Also, we haven't gotten into it yet. We will later. That Josh is very, some people might say cheap or frugal. And if he could get free rent, and Stephen was more than willing to provide because he
wasn't free.
Because he had free access to the woman of his dreams, apparently. So we also talked about the effects of early exposure to porn because Stephen exposed the boys to porn, and we talked about some of the nuances of that in a previous chapter. We also talked about voyeuristic disorder and also some aspects of narcissistic personality disorder. Berto, let's take a break. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right, we're back from the break. So that brings us to the next part of the story, which is that Josh and Susan move out of Stephen's house, presumably to get away from Stephen, and also because there was a job opportunity for both of them. They moved to Yakima, which is central Washington. It's about a 2 or 3 hour drive from where they were living in Puyallup, near Puyallup. And Josh and Susan were both going to work at a senior center. But during this time, since it's only 2 or 3 hours away, Stephen visited often because he's still obsessed with Susan. Then, after 6 months of living apart, I think because Stephen was missing Susan and because he might worry that he might, because I think in Stephen's mind, he's thinking, Susan and I were getting somewhere.
Right, and he's competing against Josh.
Yeah. And now Susan's 3 hours away. I only see her every other weekend or something. And Susan and Josh might be bonding.
Imagine that.
Right. Yeah. Because Josh and Susan were a very new couple.
Yeah.
When they moved into Stephen's place, maybe just less than a year. And so Stephen, he's losing the love of his life. He's written songs. We listened to some of those songs. So after 6 months, he visits and then figures out a way to get Susan alone in the car. And Stephen is driving, and they are about to embark on a really long drive. Who knows how Stephen managed this or if it was random, but he is filming with his video camera, and then he thinks that he turns off the video camera, but he doesn't. He puts the video camera in his pocket, and then he proceeds to accidentally record an entire conversation he has with Susan in which he confesses his love for Susan. Let's listen to that audio. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
So the audio is hard to hear. He's saying, I'm probably wrong, but I've really fallen in love with you. So this first sentence is consistent with the journals. He would sometimes throw in a caveat of, I know this might be weird. Like in one of his video journals, he says, I don't know how people are going to see this in the future. And I imagine people are going to say that there's something wrong with me. But me and Susan have a connection. He also says, and I won't show this clip because it's buried somewhere, but he talks about how, future generations, when they watch this video or, read this journal, he says, maybe they'll be our kids, me and Susan's kids, he says.
Well, and it's interesting because the way he phrases it is, I'm probably wrong, but I've really fallen in love with you.
Yeah.
Now, if you read it literally, it's like, I may or may not have fallen in love with you. But I think what he means is, it's probably wrong of me.
Yeah, and this is evidence of narcissism in that, in fact, it's one of the central tenets, really, that for people with actual narcissism, they are completely, or at least mostly, shut off from input from the outside. And they had to do that as a defense to what they were going through growing up. And when they have a feeling, there's no checks and balances. It is just all consuming to them, and there's no editor in their mind. Like if Stephen wasn't narcissistic, in the beginning of all this falling in love with her, let's say that he just had an attraction to her. Well, if he wasn't narcissistic, he would, worry about harming Josh and Susan.
Right.
So he would raise alarm bells to do something about that attraction, meaning shut it down or, figure out what's going on. And there would be an editor in his mind of, not every feeling you have is the bee's knees.
You don't have to share everything.
Well, you don't have to entertain every notion and every feeling. But when the narcissistic individual...
Oh, you mean not just about talking to her. You mean even just in his own head.
That's where it starts.
Yeah.
Because he didn't just fall in love with her overnight.
Right.
It was something that built at least over, even if it was a short amount of time, there was time to stop, But he's not completely delusional or psychopathic, because he is, and he dips into this idea throughout this conversation, this notion of he's aware that other people might consider this to be a problem.
Yeah.
So he says, I'm probably wrong, but I've really fallen in love with you. Then he says, for the last year and a half, you're about the only thing I can think about. Let's watch more.
And I don't know where it began. It probably began when you were living with me and you come into my office.
So if you didn't catch this, he says, I don't know where it began, meaning the falling in love. It probably began when you were living with me and you'd come into my office and let me feel your legs. It just went from one thing, then it just went from one thing to another. So this is an interesting statement. He is basically blaming her, that she came on to him, and that's consistent in his journal. That
it probably began when you did this to me.
Yeah. And it's hard to know what actually happened there. We talked a bit about that in the last chapter. Was she open with her body, which is fine, right? But it doesn't really matter, because even if she was giving signals or something, he went, a billion miles beyond what would have been justified.
Absolutely. And his words say a lot. Like, and you let me feel your legs, to me is pretty straightforward. She walks in. He's like, oh, your legs look great. What can I feel? And she awkwardly goes, I guess, sure.
Right.
And
Good
now
point.
She let him feel it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. That's much more likely what happened, given everything else we saw. So let's go on.
That experience on the couch, on your couch in Yakima 6 months ago was just, I know that, it was a massage, right? But just being with you for 2 hours and holding you.
So he talks about this massage a lot in his journal. I think he videotapes himself shortly after this experience. And at this point, he's saying it was 6 months ago in Yakima. So it sounds like that would have been soon after they moved to Yakima. And he's like, that experience. So he's making a case that there's justification for being obsessed with his daughter-in-law. And he says, remember that couch? the moment on the couch 6 months ago, it was a massage, but just being with you for 2 hours and holding you. That's what it's interesting, actually, now that I think about it, his narrative. If you just heard this, it sounds like, wow, that sounds really intimate, like 2 hours cuddling with your father-in-law. But in his video journal that night, he doesn't describe it that way. The way he describes it is he offered to give her a massage, and he was massaging her neck. Did you come from a family or a group when you were a kid where massages would happen?
Not in Colombia. There was tickling.
Yeah.
Tickles would
Well,
happen.
I did. I came from a family where we would massage each other all the time. It was essentially, a way for us to have physical affection.
Yeah, I feel like massages were unheard of in Colombia when I was a kid, meaning just even as a concept. I'm sure it wasn't.
Well,
but for me, I don't think until I moved up here and I didn't have
really just massages.
Yeah.
You wouldn't ever see anybody.
And the first time I ever had a massage, I was like 25.
Wow.
After a race.
Wow. No wonder you have an issue with touch. I remember in the second grade and I remember this so well because in the third grade, I remember talking with my friends about how we missed second grade the way that we were. And in second grade, it was as if we hadn't downloaded the cultural Victorian notions about touch. And so we were just free to be who we were. And my memory is that in school, whenever we were watching a film strip or a movie or something, or it was story time, we would give each other massages. And it sounds weird, right, when I say it out loud. And you think, well, was anyone uncomfortable with that? I don't know.
It's just a thing.
But I remember thinking it was just a thing. And, this is before hormones and all that kind of stuff. And none of us were thinking about boyfriend, girlfriend, or anything like that.
I see. I mean, okay, so I will say, in high school, a few times there were shoulder rubs, but definitely as a flirtatious thing.
Yeah. No.
So,
yeah. Okay. So in my family, maybe it's a Japanese thing.
Yeah.
It seemed like it might have come from that side. And we would have a lot of massage time, and I knew how each person in my family would massage my shoulders. My dad was intense with his. I mean, it was like it felt good, but it hurt at the same time.
And massages are they culturally big in Japan?
There's a lot of themes. There's shiatsu massage, and my dad was really into that. I don't know. I just know that there was a lot of that growing up, and
I think it's great.
Yeah, and
I wish there had been a lot of that.
Yeah, and as a kid, so I remember in the third grade just thinking what happened to all of us? We're all so uptight now.
I see.
And it never went back to that way. And with this family, I'm imagining that. For Susan, that's what she was thinking. It's just we're just it's a way to relieve tension in your shoulders, and it's a way to bond with people, and it feels good. I feel like in today's anti-touch world, most people would think why would you let your father-in-law give you a massage? You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's hard to say, but it seems like, at least according to Stephen, the massage lasted for a while, and the way Stephen described it right afterwards is that I crossed the line by massaging her shoulders. I put my hands into her shirt and she let me, because he's looking for signs. And this shows again that he's not delusional and he's not psychopathic, or he's really wanting her. Well, he's the way that, again, to use an analogy of healthy life, when you have a crush on someone, say you're 17 in high school, and and you have a crush on someone and she's giving you attention and you're thinking, does she like me? Does she not?
Right.
And then one day she puts her hand on your forearm when she's talking to you and you're like, oh my God,
I think she likes me.
does she like me? That's the way Stephen is talking. And it's also notable that the way Stephen talks is very childish,
Yeah.
which I think points to his traumas, but let's go on.
Yeah. Maybe I'm getting the wrong signals from you. Maybe I'm interpreting something that I shouldn't be interpreting.
Quick question. Is this all real time? Because we're not hearing any words from her.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll listen to this whole audio, but she barely says anything. But she's sitting there in the car. So, Berto, what's the most likely state of mind Susan had prior to this conversation beginning?
So I imagine that actually there was already a bit of uneasiness throughout the experiences with her father-in-law. And even just him approaching her to talk about anything would probably, this is my guess, make her somewhat uneasy. But I'm imagining she's like, oh, what are we, I'm wondering what the topic is here. I do not imagine she was anticipating this conversation.
Yeah, no, I don't think so either. Given
or she was dreading it.
Yeah. So I hadn't thought about this before, but I'll tell you that I have been obsessing on this case. In between recording chapters, you and I have been doing more deep dives. It's a very interesting case, and if anyone else wants to go down that rabbit hole, get ready for a lot of data. But I have a lot of data in my head about Susan because of her emails and her written journal and her audio journal and her friends, the way they would talk about Susan. She was on the naive side, and not in a horrible way, or you could say innocent, or thought that other people were good. She didn't seem to be suspicious of anything. And she's very young at this point. She might be 20. I think her state of mind is that she is noticing that Stephen is being flirty, but Susan is suppressing it. I think she was very good at suppressing. I think she was very good at sweeping things under the rug.
And I would imagine as a woman, as a gal, she gets attention, unwanted attention pretty regularly. It just happens to be that there's this additional category of, oh, and this is my father-in-law.
Yeah.
But there is possibly just learned behavior of like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm cute, thank you.
Yeah. There's another possibility that she did know that Stephen was clandestinely filming her and taking pictures, which isn't hard to imagine given the technology that Stephen was using to spy on her and how brazen he was with it. I mean, just sticking a giant video camera under the gap on a door and filming her while she's on the phone.
Right.
So, it's hard to know what would be going on in her mind, but it also could be in her mind of, wow, that's horrible. I don't know what to do with that. I don't really trust Josh, because maybe she would have tested the waters with Josh and Josh shut it down. We could imagine that Josh wasn't a very good listener.
Well, you could also imagine she might have even said, Josh, I think your father's like filming me, and that Josh would have been like, oh, that's just dad. He's a little weird.
Right.
Or whatever.
Right. And who do you go to with that information? You can't go to your friends. You can't go to your family, because they would either say, you're making that up, that's crazy town, or they would say, you got to get out of that family, or whatever, Right. And who knows what sort of way she was being raised, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, so there's a lot of possibilities there. But I think before this conversation with Stephen, I would imagine that she knew something was going on, and she was just trying to avoid the whole topic. And having moved to Yakima, she probably thought, okay, that's in the past. I'll just never live with Stephen again. Right. But here it is again at her doorstep. So as this conversation is beginning, Berto, he is telling her, I am in love with you because you let me touch your legs, and because of this long massage. What do you think is going through Susan's mind right now?
I am imagining there is silent panic, like deer in headlights, frozen, like, a little bit of this, what do you call it? Disembodiment or dissociation. Like, what is happening right now?
Yeah.
Because I've been in situations like that before where something completely not okay and out of context has happened. And I don't mean even when I was little. I just mean as an adult. And where you're really kind of confused. You're like, well, what am I supposed to do right now?
Yeah. What might she be thinking as a response to this? What would you be thinking if you were in her shoes?
I don't. Did you mention what I'm wondering if she was like in her car, kind of trapped, or if
she's in the passenger seat and he's driving,
and she's totally trapped.
Yeah, and they're like an hour.
Oh my gosh!
There's a long drive.
Talk about feeling trapped. Yeah. She would be thinking. I mean, I doubt that she was jumping to like, "Ooh, he might kill me" or something, right? But maybe. But at the very least,
I'd be thinking that because if someone is,
it could be, yes,
willing to go that far.
At the very least, if I were in that situation, I might be thinking, "Oh, I need to get out of this car somehow."
Yeah.
I wonder if we're going to stop at a gas station. Maybe I could just.
It's not strange for a woman to have had a previous experience where they shot down a man, whether it was a man at the bar or a boyfriend. There's a lot of women have been through scary situations where actual threats or hints at threats happen. Yeah. So it wouldn't be a stretch to imagine that she was terrified. We don't know where she was at.
Even trivially, this is nothing compared to what she's in, but like even recently, I was in a conversation with someone, 2 adults outside, just nothing where I'm feeling trapped or anything. And it has nothing to do with me really. But we're having a conversation and the person starts talking about how they're excited to get this one car that they want to get because that way they can outrun the cops because it's got more horsepower than the cop cars. And I'm sitting there wondering what the heck I would say to this person. Should I say, well, that's illegal. What are you daring? Like, what do I do? And again, I'm not comparing at all the situation. I'm saying even in something as trivial as 2 adult males out in the open talking about something that doesn't even concern me, but it's such a kind of an awkward situation. I can't even begin to imagine trapped in a car with your relative confessing their unwanted and unnatural love to you. Yeah. and
insinuating that you're
the one to, and
you were giving signals,
right? And then in that moment, also confirming everything you probably actually were suppressing in your brain. You're like, no, and then now you're like, oh yes, yikes, yeah.
So let's go on.
It just, for example, when we were sitting on the couch, it just felt like you were very, I mean, I was extremely aroused, and I think you were somewhat aroused at least.
So he's talking about, I think, the massage, and he's saying, we were sitting on the couch, and it felt just like you were, and I think he was going to say you were very aroused, and then he pauses and says, well, I was extremely aroused, and I think that you were somewhat aroused, at least I thought. So it's so interesting to hear him have those qualifiers, right? He wanted to say, you were aroused. I know you were aroused. But then he softens it a lot. I was extremely aroused. And I think you were somewhat aroused. At least I thought you were, right? And that's reflective of his journal. He's not just being nice because he's in front of her. This is the way he talked when he was just by himself.
Right.
Which is an interesting nuance to all this,
Yeah, and by the way, because you could imagine a situation like this, but way less severe, where an inappropriate, let's keep it the same, a father-in-law ends up developing feelings for the daughter-in-law, but they're not this extreme narcissistic, etc. So they end up inappropriately, but they end up going to the person and saying, I gotta let you know, I've been struggling with, this is going to sound terrible, but it's like, I've kind of developed feelings for you. Like that is one version of that, right? This one, you have to like dial all the dials to 11 for, because it's not that. It's like, well, I'm extremely in love with you and you're all I can think of. And it's when you let me do this and you did this and you were really aroused too. Like You're skipping, and she hasn't said a word yet.
Yeah.
You are now at, it is really delusional. It's incredible.
Yeah. Let's watch some more.
I thought.
I don't know where you're going with this.
And Susan, well, I'll tell you where
I'm married to your son, and I should just be the daughter-in-law.
So Susan chimes in pretty quick and says, I don't know where you're going with this. And then Stephen starts to scramble, and she interrupts and says, I'm married to your son. I should just be your daughter-in-law.
It almost feels to me, honestly, as if she's been through therapy, because this seems like such a strategically grounded way to react, because she might be frightened. I would be, right? But whatever the case may be, instead of her saying, what are you, a monster? She goes, actually, she kind of ignores everything he said. And he's like,
right.
I don't know where you're going with this, which is a great way to both invalidate, but also not attack.
Right.
And then she states a clear boundary line.
Right.
I am married to your son, and I should just be the daughter-in-law.
Right. Yeah. When I see a primary school teacher or my mom with the daycare kids, and I would just marvel at the masterful way in which they respond to really chaotic communication from another person. Because, as you said, and I didn't think this at the time, but I'm thinking it now because you said this, that, she could have said, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
That was just a massage, or I wasn't aroused, or what are you talking? I let you touch my, what are you, what's going on here? Have you been in love with me the whole time, or whatever? Or let me out of the car, or whatever it is. There's just a lot of different responses. Instead, it's just like, okay, let me interrupt you. I don't know where you're going with this.
Yeah.
But I'm married to your son, and I'm your daughter-in-law.
Yeah.
So let's just end this right now.
Yeah, and she's saying it in a way like the DMV worker. Sir, I don't know where you're going with this, but and I love it. I mean, that's right. It kind of reminds me, again, I'm not trying to compare any of these situations, just I always try to find little mini parallels. When we've discussed before, a mutual acquaintance who at one point was being fairly abusive over emails to me. And there was that shift for myself where I used to, initially, I would always try to respond point by point. And I would draft these super long emails. And a lot of ones I didn't even send, but I would still spend the time oh my gosh, well, this is wrong for this reason. And I finally got to the point where I'm like, why? I just need to be kind of like this. I don't know where you're going with this, but this is my boundary line. Yeah. And it definitely feels liberating when you can do that, even though it's still so chaotic on the other side.
Yeah. And it takes a lot of differentiation and maybe consultation with other people. How do I respond to this? And when you nail a response, you really feel good the next day about a response in person or over email or whatever. It's such a satisfying feeling that you responded and you didn't let the other person get away with it, but you also didn't dig yourself into a hole by going too far or giving them more ammunition against you.
But it's just, I'm in awe because it took me well into my 30s and therapy and guidance from peers and stuff to be able to reach a point like that in something actually less scary. I'm in awe that she just pulled this out of the hat.
Yeah. So there's a lot more to this audio. It goes on for a long time, but this is the gist of it. She doesn't say much. He keeps saying these kinds of things. And when she does say something, it's along these lines of I don't know where you're going with this. I'm your daughter-in-law. And she doesn't get into the details of it all. So let's take a break. And when we get back, it'll just be for the patrons of the podcast. And we're going to continue with the story. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
If you want to hear the full episode, all the chapters, then become a patron of the podcast. Otherwise, take care of yourself because
you deserve it.